Hey ladies, welcome to the Grit, Growth, Grace podcast. If we haven't met, my name is Anne Marie. I'm wife to James and mom to 4 beautiful kids, plus 1 miscarried baby, from 9 months up to 8 years. My hope is to help other women experience the postpartum period all the way up to the first year of baby's life as a time of grit, growth, and grace. This is episode 19. Hey lady, whether it's going back to work specifically or more generally returning to regularly scheduled programming for yourself and your family, how do you know whether it's too soon? To make sure we're starting off on the right foot, let's lay a couple ground rules for our conversation today. I'm talking about situations where you have some or complete choice about what you do. I'm not referring to situations like, Anne Marie, the baby's 4 weeks old, but the lights are shutting off next week if I'm not going back to work. Or, Anne Marie, my husband is deployed. Either I drive the kids to school or nobody drives the kids to school. If you or a mom you love find yourself in a scenario like the first, there are social service agencies and nonprofits that can absolutely help with that kind of thing. And if you're in a situation similar to the second, it's time to connect with the on-base or other military spouse support network available to you. What I'm specifically addressing throughout this episode is going back to your job, whether part-time or full-time, and or your family's regular pre-baby commitments when you have some say in the matter. I'm going to offer 4 questions to you to ask yourself as you decide and discern what makes sense for you in your situation given your family. Question number 1. Have I given it 6 weeks? I know, it might sound too cliche to just say, wait until your follow-up OB appointment or other all clear for sex or working out, as a general guideline for returning to other activities or work. Hear me out. In her book, Real Food for Pregnancy, which I referenced extensively in the episode Eat Like a Mother, registered dietitian Lily Nichols referenced the continuity amongst traditional cultures of cultivating a period of extended rest after birth for the mother-baby dyad. Most of these cultures, from the women of the Amazon to Mexico to Namibia to Korea, most of them observe a period of rest and care for the mother, especially by female relatives, of around 6 weeks or 40 days. There's a whole book by Hang Ao called The First 40 Days, exploring this concept of mothering the mother, comparing the Chinese culture she was raised in with the culture shock of the American approach to birth that often encourages, even pushes, mothers to bounce back after birth. In the first 40 days, Ao explains the Chinese practice of, I'm not going to say this correctly, but I'm going to give it my best shot, Zuo Yezi, or sitting the month. Nichols and Ao note that across many cultures, there is a belief that women who push too hard or too fast to rejoin the world after their child's birth will pay with their health. Nichols herself shared that in her own practice, her nutrition practice, she sees more breastfeeding struggles, thyroid issues, and adrenal problems in moms who tried to bounce back before they were in fact ready. That's why I'm considering 6 weeks then as a minimum threshold. For instance, in my house, I don't commit to anything that requires a hard yes or significant effort or resources from me for the first 6 weeks after birth. I don't try to homeschool my kids, though of course our grandma tribe is tremendous for finding or creating informal and occasional educational activities for them. We don't host overnight guests, other than my mother-in-law, who comes to help us after baby is born. In short, I make very few plans for those first 6 weeks. That means I've got grace built right into our schedule if the newborn didn't sleep well. Or he did, but his older brother woke up with a nightmare, or for just no reason at all. That means my main energy is going to feeding the baby and reading magazines or flower arranging or charcuterie board books from the library. We've got time and space to be very family-focused during this time of adjustment. But after 6 weeks, then what? Is it time to go back to work? To start up the after-school carpool parade and shuffle from one activity to the next? Let's talk about work first, since presumably it'd be good for you to get paid again, and maybe a part, but not all of your maternity leave is paid. Let's say it would be nice, though, not vital, but nice, to have that cushion back in the budget. Here's the next question to ask yourself then. Question number 2. Am I going back to work, etc., to prove or please? Do I feel the need to prove myself, whether to myself or others? Am I trying to please someone? After my first child was born, I had 12 full weeks of leave before I returned to full-time nursing in the ICU. After my second child was born, I returned to work at 6 weeks. I figured that because my physical recovery had gone so much better, and because I was down to working part-time, though still on my feet for 12 hours at a time in the ICU, it was no big deal. I chose to prove myself to myself, telling myself I was ready to get after it. That was not the case, as I learned through the major emotional challenges of the next few years, which I shared in part 2 of A Tale of 4 Postpartum Stories. Now, did my going back too soon single-handedly launch the 1,000 ships of all those emotional struggles? No, ma'am, it didn't. But did going back too soon tip the scales at a time and in an area in which I was already vulnerable? I think so. With my third living child, so after the miscarriage, I wasn't going back to nursing. I'd stopped bedside nursing during my pregnancy with him. I returned to writing, though, and I wasn't yet in either my associate editor or managing editor roles. I was just writing articles for various places, and that was around 6 weeks, and that worked out okay. With my fourth child, though, this last time, I returned to my editing role at 6 weeks and realized afterwards that was too soon. I told myself stories about how my boss and our founder really needed me to get back to work, even though neither of them pressured me in any significant way, and I know they would have honored my needing more time if I'd been willing to honor it myself. I tried to please them, even though they hadn't asked for it. In reality, I said I was going to start back by working a third of my regular schedule, essentially like a third of the hours of my regular schedule. But that wasn't possible, at least not with the expectations I set for myself as to what and how much I was going to get done during my work time. I did not honor my own time commitment or boundaries, so my work felt mostly stressful initially. Now, the good news is, like you, I am a big girl, capable of learning from her mistakes. Over the months, my skill at honoring my own time boundaries grew significantly. I now work only the hours that I've said I would. If there are things that don't get done, they wait. I am not in the ICU. No one is on fire. By the way, is anyone on fire is a tongue-in-cheek question I've learned to ask myself when I'm tempted to try to do just one more thing, whether at work or with another commitment. Let's say for a second, though, that you're experiencing subtle or overt pressure to get back to fill in the blank. Maybe you are planning to drop down to part-time or PRN, which means as needed in the medical world. I don't know where the pressure is coming from. Might be a particular person of influence in your life, or more a vague cultural sense that this is what you should do. I'm going to share a few thoughts from book 1 of the Summa Domestica trilogy I've mentioned before. I will also advise you that you may feel prickly about these thoughts at first. It's okay for you and I to feel prickly sometimes. Sometimes prickly comes before acceptance of an idea. Sometimes it comes before rejection of an idea. Feeling prickly, or vaguely annoyed, or offended is simply a signpost for you and I to take note of. Is there something here for me to mull over more deeply? So with that preamble, here are the quotes. The author writes of women, "We too have a nature, and this nature tend towards doubt and readiness to listen to another voice. We women tend to be ready to be convinced against our own interests." End quote. And elsewhere she writes, "Within the bosom of the woman is a deep desire to be home. The problem is that, as a result of having a nurturing nature, women are good at doing what other people think they should do. The tendency to doubt that the woman has an irreplaceable role in the home means that sometimes women find it difficult to admit that what other people expect is not what they truly desire." End quote. At first blush, I felt offended that she would broad brush women by stating that they have a tendency to doubt and to listen to another voice. But, well, that is my actual lived experience, and the lived experience in one way or another of virtually every woman I know. As you consider returning to work or other activities then, I simply invite you to ask yourself as honestly as you can, whether it's someone else's voice or your own that says doing so, returning to whatever, is a good idea. And I want to pause here for just a second too, because I can see where you might ask, right? Or you might say, Anne Marie, I don't really have control over X, Y, or Z. Like, it's not an option for me to consider doing things differently than whatever that needs to happen. I need to drive my kids to this place. I need to work in this way at this time in these circumstances. And I guess here's what I would love to invite you to. Do you really? And I'm asking that honestly. Sometimes I think we don't reevaluate what could change in our lives because we assume that it can't. I don't know in your particular circumstances, lady, what is or isn't possible. I'm just telling you, I think we tend to ask ourselves what's possible far less often than we ought. And I think we often assume that X, Y, or Z cannot possibly change, when that may not always 100% of the time be the case. This has been some episodes back now, but I talked about how if a statement that we make is not 100% true 100% of the time, then it is a story, and we are welcome to question our stories. If something is 100% true 100% of the time, then that is a fact. So I would simply ask you, if maybe you're wanting to return to 50% of, let's say, the job that you were used to doing, like 50% of the hours, but you might think, I couldn't possibly, that would never work. Okay, you might be right. You might be right. But could you at least pursue it? Could you just ask the question? And similarly, if you're thinking well, if I have to do this thing or that thing with my family, we couldn't change that. Okay, that might be the case. But does it have to be? Is there any sense in which it could change? The time commitment, when or how you do the thing? Just a question to consider. So to recap, question number 1 was, have I given it 6 weeks? Questions number 2 and 3 were, am I going back to prove something or please someone? And question number 4, the final question, as you consider whether to resume your usual activities or return to work, is, am I running away from anything? Am I running away from anything? Sometimes we want to jump back into a thing or things we're good at, accomplished at, and receive praise from, because so much of new motherhood, including new motherhood when we already have other children, feels foreign or boring or hard or all three. It makes perfect sense that you and I would want to do what we're good at because that makes us feel good. There are all kinds of things in those first months and year with a new baby that we feel insecure or uncertain or questioning about. There's nothing wrong with desiring to do something we feel confident in. That makes us human. January Donovan says, competence breeds confidence. I'd wager that the familiar thing you're considering going back to is something you're competent and therefore confident in. But you and I, as moms, are called to competence in our motherhood as well. I'm not saying don't return to work, don't go back to your volunteering or what have you outside the home. I am inviting you, if the desire to get back to those things comes from a place of running away from something you don't feel competent at, in other words, you feel anxious about, I'm inviting you to lean into that discomfort instead and seek to grow towards competence. There are many skills necessary to become competent at mothering. This week's email, which you can sign up for at postpartumonpurpose.com, will offer you several resources that have helped me in my own growth. All right, lady, those are just some thoughts for your consideration. I touched very lightly on it in this episode, but one reason you might want to return to work is for the financial cushion it provides your family. Next episode, let's talk about stretching your dollars during postpartum, with or without maternity leave or paid work outside the home, especially if during maternity leave or in general you are discerning as a couple that you're not returning to work outside the home or planning to do so with reduced hours. I'll talk to you then.